Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in here as we move quickly through our English 2250 Intro to Creative Writing class. So a couple of kind of generic grading comments here, especially now that we're starting to accumulate a few things. We're moving through our first few units pretty quickly. We also quasi-slow down, actually, which is kind of nice. As we get into some of the other slightly longer, more involved writing assignments that we're doing. But some generic grading things now that we have a few grades under our belt. We'll look at upcoming units here, and we'll just start with our due date. So again, I'm recording this on Tuesday, October 23rd. So we are looking at the primary or first due date for our combined units 3 and 4. Again, we've done 1 and 2 together. Now we're doing 3 and 4, but you'll notice that we don't repeat that like let's do 2 units at a time. So like I said before, we kind of go definitely more quickly than I would normally prefer, just because of our 8-week format early on to free up a little bit of time down here, right? And we'll talk about that in just a sec. So we're looking at that primary due date. So main work for both units 3 and 4 is done. And then there's various assignments that have a reply component. So we're looking at that Thursday then to do the replies. And like I mentioned before, you should be done this part. Maybe you've gotten here and finished up this part, or you're still kind of working on this. But there's nothing to say you can't jump into this part of the our next assignment too. So I'm going to look at Unit 5 in just a sec, but I'm actually going to jump into our first fiction workshop, or our short story workshop, which is Unit 6. So it's still like within the context of our class, sort of like far away, quote unquote. But it's definitely something that you want to be thinking about and working on now. So unlike most units where you kind of wrap things up and then move on to the next assignment, here you really want to be looking forward, since your job is to write a short story. So because it's a workshop class, we understand that we're coming in, we're looking for feedback. We're not pretending that this is perfect and ready to be published, and we're just going to defend it because we worked on it so much it's perfect, etc., etc. It should have a pretty clear beginning, middle, and end. It should reflect a few rounds of kind of like editing, so it looks like we spent time on it, but I would even say more revision, like we've actually changed some things around. It's not all just jumbled and written the night before, but we're not pretending that this is polished, finished, perfect work. Having said that, though, you don't want to be waiting until like, Tuesday or the Monday before to start your short story, because it's a not just a longer like page count or word count wise assignment, but it's a little bit more involved. It's really pulling a lot of threads together that we've looked at in our class, whether it's conceptual stuff like the rules of creative writing, thinking about some of the glossary terms and obviously the ideas behind those, but really sort of pulling a lot of different threads together. So it's just a little bit more involved. So I'm going to jump in and take a quick look. I've said before that the workshop model is really like the core, the pillar of this class. It's the most, I think the most beneficial part of the class is that it forces you to write, right? It gives you those due dates. That might sound really pedantic or kind of practical, but the more you pursue either the hobby or the profession or the side profession of writing, the more you'll realize that having those imposed due dates is like a blessing, even though it sometimes feels like a curse. Trust me, I know. Okay, so I'll come back to this in just a sec, but the assignment here, and again, we're looking ahead, but this is something you should be thinking about now and starting to work on now, so you're not trying to piece it together at the last minute. The assignment is just to write a short story. The word count is, it's really just a ballpark. We don't want it so short that clearly you haven't really spent time on it. Don't pull some previous 10,000 word novella or some chapter that you've written before. It's going to be just hard to deal with from your group members' perspectives because there's so much, text there. But also, we want to make sure that we're coming into this with fresh work that we've produced that reflect our thinking in this course, like some of the concepts, ideas that we've covered. And we don't want to, like I said before, pull something that we feel is pretty much done, but now I'm going to give it to a workshop group to get comments back for how to make it better. That's just like it's a dynamic that is counterintuitive, counterproductive for our purposes. So again, the word count is what it is, but a short story. And again, depending on style, you can have a word count wise very short story that does a whole bunch of storytelling. And by the same token, depending on stylistic things, you could have like a lot of words on the page that maybe don't really need to be there, or aren't producing a lot of story. One of the most efficient novels I've ever read, I would contend maybe one of the most ever, is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, right? A famous book for lots of other reasons, but to me there's like no wasted energy in that book. It's fairly short as novels go, but every single word, every phrase, every description, every sort of gesture that's described, it all contributes. So that's kind of what we're going for. Not that style, not that subject matter, but the idea that every word on the page is doing work. That doesn't mean we try to write the shortest short story possible, but we don't want to just start typing and typing and typing, and then when we hit a certain word count, we figure, okay, we're done. I sort of have half of an introduction basically here and nothing else, but I met the word count, so I'm good. That's not what we want. Again, subject matter and genre, completely up to you. There's a couple of notes here about certain kinds of fan fiction. Also, people might be wondering about like how adult can I be or real world can I be? We are adults taking a college class. That means that we can reflect a world where people swear, they have sex with one another. Sometimes the two go together, just saying. There's violence in the world. We can have those in short stories. That's part of what art sometimes addresses. But I am personally going to be the final arbiter, just in case you're sort of nervous or worried about this. If I see something that is any of these things that I perceive to be threatening to anybody, certainly specifically in our class, but even just kind of generically towards women, towards young people, towards whatever, that is clearly there just for shock value. It's not contributing to the story. It's not doing any work. It's kind of like this efficiency model. I will definitely intervene. So there's really less gray area than you might think as far as me taking action to protect people in the course. Again, not from, oh my gosh, a character swore, oh, I'm too dainty for that. That's kind of your own thing to deal with. But if there's gratuitous sex, violence, if it's clearly meant to just sort of intimidate class members, that's not cool. You might even take a moment to think about the workshop as a sort of format where, again, in the real world, we find something that just has too much of this stuff. We think it's lame and ugly, so we just put it down. We don't read it. We don't pay attention to it. We don't pay to see the movie, whatever. In our workshop environment, people don't have that choice, right? Their grade depends on their participation in reading your work. So again, I'm not suggesting people shy away from what we know is part of the real world, an all too real part. But I am also going to put my foot down really quickly and decisively if I deem this to just be there to shock people or to, make people intentionally uncomfortable, and there's really no artistic value to it. It's just there to be there. That's like, and to be perfectly honest, I don't think I've ever seen that. Like over my decade and a half of teaching, I could point to one or two cases, one or two pieces of work, not whole classes, where this has sort of happened. And honestly, everybody realized it. It was actually fairly easy to deal with. So having said that, right, the world is kind of your oyster when it comes to subject matter, style, any of that. I would avoid certain kinds of really specific genre or fan fiction because those tend to depend on certain conventions, or especially fan fiction requires that we know who those characters are, what that world is like. So that doesn't always work for presenting a story to a group of people who are not immersed in that fan fiction world. So again, just be careful about some of the genres that you're writing in, not because they're bad per se, but they just don't really work for our purposes. Edit, revise, right? At the end of the day, your work should show some degree of time on task, right? Effort, commitment on your part. Again, to reiterate, we're not looking for perfect polished work. And so that kind of leads me to the whole grading scheme, which I've mentioned before. So you don't submit a short story, I read it, and I decide this is an A short story, this is a B short story, etc., etc., etc. The whole premise of the class is for you to be exposed to some ideas about creative writing across a variety of genres. Maybe they're new to you, maybe they're kind of new to you. But the purpose is to try them out. So it would be totally lame if I set that framework up for you to be experimental, right? To try things that you haven't tried before. And I'm not talking about creating avant-garde art here. I'm just saying doing things that you haven't done before, writing out of your comfort zone. And then you do that, and I'm like, ha ha, sucker, here's your C because it didn't come off very well. That's totally not how the course is set up. So again, really worth going back to how the workshops work, a note on feedback, and just understanding where the points come from in our workshops. They're out of 100, right? Our whole course is 1,000, so you get the kind of weighting that this part of our class has. A portion of that comes from just posting your document URL correctly, and you'll notice that this assignment is actually quite long. There's a lot of text, but a lot of it is just this screenshot stuff about updating your portfolio, or you know, sharing out the URL, which we've done in previous units. There's a little piece of the group thing here. So it's like a lot of text, but it's not all just assignment text exactly. Back to the grade though. So you've posted on time and the URL is correct and we can get to it. That's pretty low hanging fruit, honestly. It has nothing to do with the quote unquote quality of your short story. The bulk of the grade actually comes not from your writing the short story, but the comments that you provide to others. So again, reviewing how the workshops work is really, really important. How to post, how to provide feedback is super important. And again, you know, just the mechanics of it, working in Google Docs to provide comments. And then I won't go through this like point by point, but you should, because this is the bulk of your grade. It's not, are you a great short story writer? That's not what the class is about. It's about, can you invest some time in writing a short story, but also in giving meaningful comments back to somebody who wants to improve as a writer. And so it can feel weird at first, especially if you're just you're a student in the class, you're reading this work, you have no pretensions to being a published author. Like, who am I to say that this is good, bad, or indifferent? Well, you're the perfect person to say that because you are the type of reader that we're writing for. You're someone who's invested, has some knowledge and interest in the area of creative writing. You're not just like somebody off the street or a generic person. You know, you're an invested reader. You don't have to be an expert to react to something and like it or dislike it. We just want to take our comments for folks beyond the I like this, I didn't like this, and explain why in a really specific way, and even suggest some possible revisions. Now, the nice thing as an author is you can look at those suggestions, think about them globally, like do they point to certain trends in your writing that are strengths or maybe things to improve, but it's not like you then have to go and make every single change that every single person has suggested. Some will strike you as really beneficial, others maybe not so much, right? And again, there's no real revision part of our class. We don't resubmit this short story. I mean, we can barely get through the units we've got in 8 weeks, so going kind of backwards is pretty tricky. But you should be attending to those comments. So, long story short, jump into Unit 6 to understand, right, the posting part, making sure you're sharing your file correctly. If you share it and we can only view it, then you're not going to get comments. That's a problem. It becomes really difficult for other people, right? And then again, start thinking now about your short story, not the day before, and then you kind of slap something together. So again, grading-wise, it's mostly about posting on time, making sure you've shared your doc correctly, and then your investment in comments to others. I'm always open to talking further about your short story and the sort of craft of it, but I'll let you reach out to me rather than providing like pages and pages of commentary to every single person. There's no way I could keep up, honestly. Let's see, what else? I think a lot of the grading in a class like ours really comes from, you know, there's no rubric I provide. There's no checklist of 5 things you have to do to get an A, 4 things gives you a B, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really work, right, for our particular discipline that we're working in here. But that doesn't mean that it's just a total free-for-all and I'm making numbers up out of the blue. There's still clearly times when you've invested time and effort in what you're doing, or you haven't. In a typical unit, you know, where we have a post and then replies, again, if you're getting like a 40 or a 45 out of that 50, maybe you're fulfilling the requirements, but you know, you might want to go back to discussion board grading. Your replies aren't built out that much. So it's a sentence or two. Okay, that's pretty good, but we could certainly do better. So it's not an exact science, but again, it's not like, I'm just guessing at numbers here. Also, before we look at Unit 5, which is where we're at now, as you look at your grades coming back, always think in terms of the full 1,000 for our class. So if you get like a 50 out of 50, isn't just I met all the requirements, because we usually don't have that checklist of things that equals perfect grade. The perfect score is really reserved for, obviously you've done the requirements, but you've really gone above and beyond in terms of pulling different threads together in your like response, or just really developing something. You know, it's really, really stellar work. Moving down from that, a 45 out of 50, let's say, is again still really good, but maybe there was some room for a little bit of improvement. It's not like you've done poor work. Even I would say something like a 40 out of 50. Your brain probably goes, because that's what mine would do, or did do as a student, would go, oh my God, 80%, oh my God, a B, oh my God, etc., etc. But don't do that. Think of it as, okay, it's 40 out of 1,000 versus 45 out of 1,000. Like we're talking about 5 points out of 1,000. You can do the percentage math on that. It's a really, really small sliver. And again, it doesn't mean that you got a B, even though it sort of calculates that way. It meant that maybe the replies weren't developed, maybe the writing was a little sloppier than it could have been. You know, it's not that big a deal. Keep that global picture in mind. Okay, significant objects. This is one of my favorite units. And it's kind of like a mini short story, mini workshop to sort of prep us for the workshop that we're moving towards, and you'll see how it works here. So significant objects, we're going to work with these things called tchotchkes, you know, these little doohickeys that we all have around our house. You might be saying, I don't have any tchotchkes. Trust me, you have tchotchkes. The assignment here stems from this audio program I heard years ago now. It's about a book called Significant Objects. I'm running long on this, so I'm not going to spend much time explaining. You can listen to it. You can link to the website, but also the website for the book, and see the examples. And then our assignment, notice we have some groups set up again, is to write a significant object story. Again, it's all sort of explained here, so I'm not going to go to it at length, but I am going to highlight this part, avoiding the common mistake. So your job is to impute value to an otherwise valueless object, the tchotchke, the little doohickey that you find and take a picture of that's hanging around your house collecting dust. It has to then be valuable because of the backstory you provide to it, which has value, or seems to have value, publicly. It can't just be valuable because your mom or your grandma owned it. That's private, personal value, which is important, but we're trying to imagine imparting kind of public value to these things. And you'll see how that works, especially in the example that is talked about in the audio here, and also especially this little Russian figure one, which is, I think, really funny, but it's really like compelling as a story because of its big public significance, right? It has a big history. You'll see how that works. So that's what we're writing here. Again, the requirements, right? Length, we're keeping it really short. We are going to work in some workshop groups, reminders about how to share your document, posting it, etc., doing the comment. So again, this initial post date and the reply date's really important. And then set up so you're posting the URL to your document so that your group can edit. And if we take a look here, you'll see that I've set up threads for each of the groups. So all you need to do is find your name and click in, and then post your URL just by replying to my initial thread. And then by that second due date, making sure that you go in, and if I'm Jason, which I actually am, in name at least, I'm going to go into Anna's document through her URL, Brianna's document through that URL, and do some commenting in that document about her significant object short story. So it's basically, like I said, a sort of mini workshop here. All right, so that was a lot to digest. Hopefully these are helping to sort of clarify things as we move forward. Let's take one last look at due dates before I sign off. I know these are long, but shoot, you'd be in class for like, what, 6 hours a week in class if this were a face-to-face. So 20 minutes of video, not so bad. All right, we raced through here. We raced through here. We have a little bit more wiggle room to do our first kind of mini workshop, the significant objects, and then more time still to do our writing of the short story and posting it, and then some turnaround time so that you're getting feedback. And then, of course, we reboot and move into a whole different genre. So there's no rest for the wicked in our 8-week 2250 class. All right? So keep an eye on those due dates. They come fast and furious. Be sure to read assignments carefully. If you find things that don't make sense, or there's a link that doesn't work, or whatever, by all means be in touch with me. Keep individual assignment grades in perspective of like our whole 1,000-point class, so don't get too hung up on a 40 versus a 45, for example. And as always, especially as we start to generate more writing, right, we get down here, if you want further feedback, by all means be in touch with me. I'd love to have that conversation with you. Okay? Hopefully you're enjoying the class, kind of seeing how things are shaking out here, and we can breathe a little bit once we get down into these later due dates. All right, hang in there, and I'll talk with everybody soon.